So, real talk, if you grew up watching Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, there's a pretty good chance you thought it was just the American version of a Japanese show. I mean, that's what I thought, but the truth is, that's not the case at all. The series was basically the biggest TV remix that's ever been made, because Season 1 borrowed action footage from Kyōryū Sentai Zyuranger, and then again, Season 2 started using footage from Gosei Sentai Dairanger, and then Season 3 again switched to Ninja Sentai Kakuranger. And here, turns out Saban borrowed action footage from 3 different unrelated shows and morphed it into one complete package. That's why today we're going to be breaking down the 15 wildest ways Mighty Morphin Power Rangers diverged from the original Super Sentai, and to be real with you guys, it's honestly way weirder than you might realize. Let's get into it. One American show, 3 Japanese sources. One thing you need to know is that Mighty Morphin Power Rangers wasn't just adapted from one Japanese show, it was actually built from 3 completely different Sentai series. The first season of Power Rangers borrowed most of the action footage from Kyōryū Sentai Zyuranger, which included the main Ranger suits and dinosaur themes. And by that I mean the iconic dinosaur-themed Ranger suits like Red Tyrannosaurus, Black Mastodon, Blue Triceratops, they all practically became the face of Power Rangers. Almost all of the morphed fight scenes, martial arts battles, and Megazord fights were taken from Zyuranger for MMPR Season 1. Even though MMPR did borrow visuals from Zyuranger, the story was completely different. It wasn't about American teenagers who were chosen by Zordon. Instead, the Rangers were 5 warriors from prehistoric civilizations who were awakened after millions of years to stop the witch Bandora. Then, for Season 2, MMPR continued using the original Ranger suits while incorporating footage from Gosei Sentai Dairanger for the Thunderzords, White Ranger, and many monsters. For Season 3, it incorporated footage from Ninja Sentai Kakuranger for the Shogun swords and monsters, and later introduced the Kakuranger suits as the alien Rangers. So each Super Sentai series was an independent yearly show in Japan which had its own story, villains, and cast. These shows were never meant to connect. Now, Saban had stitched all 3 Super Sentai series into one story, making it seem like the Rangers were just one team that had developed through 3 seasons. Zyuranger only had 50 episodes, so Saban eventually exhausted most of the available Zyuranger footage, after which Toei also produced additional Japanese action footage specifically for Mighty Morphin Power Rangers before more Dairanger footage was incorporated. The original MMPR suits had become wildly popular through TV, toys, and merchandise, so instead of changing the Zyuranger's Ranger suits, they borrowed Dairanger's Zords, monsters, and White Ranger footage, as we already mentioned. So basically, every major difference between Mighty Morphin Power Rangers and Super Sentai, the story, the costumes, the Zords, the villains, and the original American footage, stemmed from the fact that America had merged 3 unrelated shows into one. Ancient mythic warriors versus modern American teenagers. Even though the Rangers wore the same suits, their origins were completely different. In Zyuranger, the Rangers were ancient warriors from prehistoric tribes who lived 170 million years ago. After defeating Bandora, they were sealed in suspended animation and then awakened again whenever she returned. The Zyuranger was a story that was completely rooted in mythology, magic, ancient civilizations, and destiny. But MMPR wasn't really like that. Their storyline was different despite having a similar idea of Rangers. MMPR had Jason, Zach, Billy, Trini, and Kimberly, who were just ordinary high school students chosen by Zordon because of their courage and character. Their world simply revolved around school, family, sports, and other typical teenage problems. Zyuranger felt like a mythological adventure about heroes who were returning after millions of years, but Mighty Morphin Power Rangers was a coming-of-age series that gave teens something to look up to. Saban made this change so that kids in the 90s could relate to the Rangers and actually see themselves in their place. And a high school setting also gave a lot of familiar vibes that teens were already accustomed to, and it allowed the episodes to explore the balance between superhero action, school drama, friendships, bullies, and exams. And one more plus point was that since the Rangers were new to their powers, the audience also got a chance to learn along with them, and this created character development and moral lessons throughout the series. That's a pretty major difference. Bandora's dead child, the dark origin Rita never got. Okay, so this is probably the biggest wait what moment for anyone who only grew up watching Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. In MMPR, Rita Repulsa was basically introduced as this dramatic witch who was basically evil because, well, she was Rita Repulsa. That's what she did. Immediately after escaping her dumpster, she started beefing with Zordon, yelled at Goldar every 5 minutes, and then spent the rest of the series trying to destroy the Rangers. Now, let's take a look at her Japanese counterpart, Bandora. Her story is actually really heartbreaking. Bandora was actually the queen of the doll tribe and had a young son named Kai long before she became the main villain. One day, Kai was caught breaking Tyrannosaurus eggs. As the mother Tyrannosaurus chased him, he fell from a cliff and was killed. And that single moment completely shattered her. Not being able to accept what had happened, her grief slowly turned into pure hatred. Instead of healing, she made the worst deal you can imagine. Bandora sold her soul to the great Satan, embraced darkness, and helped wipe out the dinosaurs themselves. And at this point, it wasn't even about revenge, it had just become an obsession that was fueled by the pain she couldn't let go of. And here's where things got even sadder. Over time, Bandora buried the memories of her own son beneath all of her hatred. She still hated children with every bone in her body, but she just couldn't remember why. And it wasn't until much later in the series that those buried memories just came rushing back, which reminded her that underneath all that rage was a mother who had never even recovered from losing her own child. And that one storyline completely changed your perspective of her, as Bandora wasn't just another cartoon villain who was trying to take over the world, she was someone whose grief had consumed her to a point where there was barely any humanity left. Meanwhile, MMPR stripped all of that away, and Rita Repulsa became an over-the-top, scene-chewing villain whose personality was unforgettable, but whose backstory was almost completely absent. The costume and much of the physical footage were the same, but the voice, dialogue, and backstory were completely different. Emotionally, these two characters were on entirely different levels. Grifforzer and Lammy, married villains with a baby. Now, allow me to present a detail that has completely disappeared from the American version. If you've only seen Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, you'd probably assume Goldar and Scorpina were just two of Rita's strongest henchmen. They worked together sometimes, fought the Rangers, and they got yelled at by Rita, and that was pretty much it. But Zyuranger said, actually, they're married. Goldar's Japanese counterpart, Grifforzer, and Scorpina's counterpart, Lammy, were introduced as husband and wife, and they were genuinely devoted to each other. Lammy wasn't just another villain who joined the team, she was introduced after spending a long period sealed inside a giant boulder before eventually reuniting with Grifforzer. And I mean, that's commitment on another level, and it doesn't even stop there. By the end of the series, even after Bandora's gang has been defeated and imprisoned, there was one wholesome moment where everyone celebrated because Grifforzer and Lammy had welcomed a baby. And yep, that's how the villain couple literally became parents. Now, MMPR completely deleted that relationship. Goldar and Scorpina never got any romantic storyline, they never even acknowledged each other in any other way, and they certainly never started a family together. It was just one of those little details that disappeared because the American version mostly reused the action scenes, while the dialogue and character relationships that actually gave those scenes an emotional context was left behind. Mythic fantasy versus teen sitcom. Completely different tone. So the tone of these shows wasn't really determined by what happened in the stories, but by how the story was presented. The two shows could tell stories about similar events, but leave completely different emotions. Zyuranger generally embraces a fairy tale structure, with many episodes feeling like self-contained myths or fables. MMPR's episodes were built around a familiar rhythm that audiences would quickly recognize. Problems were introduced, the Rangers investigated, a battle followed, and the episode simply wrapped up with a positive resolution. The predictable structure also made MMPR feel more like a comforting after-school adventure. Zyuranger also generally spends more time building suspense before major confrontations, allowing dramatic moments to linger, while Mighty Morphin Power Rangers generally kept the pace moving quickly between dialogue, action, and comedy to maintain the energy. So, as you can see, the biggest tonal difference wasn't found in the monsters or the costumes, it was actually found in the storytelling. One series invited viewers into a mythical world where legends shaped the present, while the other just delivered a fast-paced superhero adventure that was designed to entertain, inspire, and send the audience home with a smile on their faces. The tone was what made the two shows feel so distinct, even when they sometimes had similar kinds of stories. Power Rangers forces one big continuity. Sentai mostly doesn't. The biggest differences between these franchises aren't their costumes or their monsters, it's actually how they tell their stories. During its early years, Power Rangers placed a much stronger emphasis on one connected storyline than Super Sentai. When a new team showed up, it's not like the old ones were just removed like that. Characters did come back, crossover episodes took place, and old powers were mentioned again, so the story kept on building on what had already come before. During the early years especially, everything was connected through Zordon, who was the command center, and also the Rangers' shared history. It made the entire franchise feel like one long adventure instead of just a bunch of separate shows, but Super Sentai did things very differently. In Japan, every new season was basically a fresh start. There were new Rangers, new villains, new powers, a new world, and even a new story. Once one team had finished its journey, the next usually began a new self-contained story with its own characters, villains, and setting. They also didn't spend too much time trying to explain how every season fit together. To be honest, they didn't even need to. Of course, there were crossover movies and anniversary specials where different Ranger teams met with each other, but most of the time, fans were just expected to enjoy the team up without overthinking every continuity detail. However, there was a huge expectation, which was Kyōryū Sentai Gokaiger. That season was simply made to celebrate the history of Super Sentai, so it brought back tons of past teams, old heroes, and classic moments. It also proved that Japan absolutely could make one big connected story whenever it wanted to, so the difference wasn't what each franchise was capable of, it was actually what the approach was. Power Rangers emphasized a stronger ongoing continuity during its early years, while Super Sentai generally focused on telling a new self-contained story each season. Hybrid production, new American drama, Japanese action. MMPR wasn't simply dubbed into English or remade from scratch, it was actually produced using a hybrid filmmaking approach that combined footage from two separate productions. In the American production, Saban had filmed most of the civilian ranger scenes with the American cast, which included life at Angel Grove High, the youth center, the command center, character interactions, comedy, and emotional moments, and those scenes were specifically for MMPR and were shot in California. Toei supplied most of the large-scale action, including ranger battles, aftermorphing, monster fights, Zord battles, explosions, and all that. The footage was actually filmed for Super Sentai long before MMPR episodes were even assembled, so every episode had to combine American drama with Japanese action, and editors were really careful while arranging the scenes so that the transition between the two felt as natural as possible. That said, attentive viewers could easily spot changes in lighting and color grading, and even a slight difference in film quality or camera style. Fight scenes could be shortened and reordered because American producers weren't limited to using Japanese footage as it already existed. Now, as the franchise continued, more original action had to be shot, especially when the available Sentai no longer matched the story Saban wanted to tell. So MMPR was just a technical collaboration between two separate productions. Censorship and content edits beyond just tone. The changes didn't just stop with the story, they even changed the actual footage. Even though MMPR reused a lot of the same action footage from Super Sentai, it didn't always use every single shot. Some scenes were trimmed, some were edited differently, and some never even made it to the American version at all. One reason was that MMPR had to meet American children's television broadcast standards, which often required changes to adapted footage. In Super Sentai, the fights hit a little harder sometimes. The camera might have stayed on a character getting hurt for a bit longer, shown a stronger attack, or let an emotional moment have a minute before moving on. Things never got super graphic, but it definitely went a little more intense. MMPR usually toned all of that down. Some shots were shortened, rearranged, or omitted to better fit the show's format and broadcast standards. The goal wasn't necessarily to change every fight, but to adapt the footage to fit MMPR's storytelling and broadcast requirements. Now, don't get it twisted, this wasn't on the same level as the heavy censorship that you've probably seen in shows like Dragon Ball Z. Most of the action was still there, but when you actually add up all those tiny edits, they actually make a bigger difference than you might expect. It was actually kind of wild. Sometimes the biggest difference between Super Sentai and Power Rangers wasn't a brand new scene or a rewritten story, it was literally a few seconds of footage that had gotten trimmed, replaced, or removed, and that alone could make MMPR feel much lighter overall. Completely different music and audio identity. So music was one of the few things that MMPR rarely borrowed from Super Sentai. Even when the visuals were almost identical, the music was always made from scratch for the American audience. For example, MMPR's Go-Go Power Rangers theme by Ron Wasserman became one of the most recognizable TV themes of the 1990s. It had really heavy guitar, drums, and energetic vocals that made the Power Rangers feel like a very fast superhero action series. Zyuranger, meanwhile, had its own Japanese opening theme, which had a more orchestral style, which which complemented the mythological tone of the series. And that difference actually goes far beyond just opening songs. MMPR replaced all of Zyuranger's background music with an original American tone. Starting with the fight scenes, Zord battles, command center scenes, and emotional moments, MMPR largely replaced Zyuranger's background music, newly composed American music. Sentai also let emotional scenes breathe, helping them with softer and more emotional music in the background. But MMPR generally kept scenes moving with continuous background music, which carried an energetic and faster pace. Even Rita Repulsa received an entirely new English voice performance, giving her a very different personality from Bandora's original Japanese portrayal. And likewise, many other monsters also received completely new voices and vocal performances. So what we gather here is that two scenes could have the same punches and explosions. There would be a noticeable change in music, sound effects, and voice performances. Different toy and merch strategies on each side. Super Sentai and Power Rangers weren't just TV shows, they were also merchandise-driven franchises. The TV series existed partly to introduce new toys, but Japan and America had very different approaches to that. Bandai Japan had manufactured and designed original Super Sentai toys according to Toei's production schedule. For Power Rangers, Bandai America adapted many of these products for Western markets, often changing branding, packaging, and in some cases, the toys themselves. In Japan, the release of the toys was in sync with the TV series. There was a new weapon, Zord, or Ranger. The toys would usually be available in most toy shops. And in the US, the toy release had to match Saban's adaptation schedule, which often lagged behind Japan by months or even years. Then, Japanese packaging promoted the current Super Sentai team as a standalone series. The American packaging emphasized the Power Rangers brand first. Since the original Mighty Morphin Power Rangers suits became very successful on store shelves, Saban chose to keep them around longer than Japan did. As a result, children could simply buy toys from Zyuranger, Dairanger, and Kakuranger as if all of them belonged to the same world, even though they had arrived from separate Japanese shows. Then, the toys were also frequently given new English names that would better fit the MMPR terminology. Not every Japanese toy was released in America, and Bandai America selected which products would be released for the Western market. So the branding wasn't just translated, it was rebranded, reorganized, and marketed to support a completely different television franchise. Visual patchwork, locations, film stock, and stunts. Once you find out how the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers was made, you literally won't be able to unsee it. Most of the suit fights and giant monster battles were filmed in Japan by Japanese stunt teams using Japanese locations and cameras, although MMPR also incorporated specially commissioned and original American-shot action footage. But all the scenes with the Rangers out of costume, at school, the juice bar, and all that, those were filmed in America with a completely different crew, and yes, that switch was kind of hilarious sometimes. 1 second, we see the Rangers chilling in sunny California. 5 seconds later, they're throwing hands in a random rock quarry that just came out of nowhere, as we talked about previously. Back in the 90s, people weren't pausing their VHS tapes to investigate, but now, with modern digital releases and larger TVs, the edits are much easier to catch, and once you notice them, your brain starts playing detective for the rest of the episode. You'll be sitting there like, wait, weren't they just somewhere else a second ago? And honestly, it's kind of funny, but also pretty impressive. Saban somehow managed to glue together footage that was filmed in 2 different countries by 2 different production teams, and they also convinced an entire generation that all of it was one single show. That's why MMPR had such a unique look, and the little visual mismatches are basically a part of its personality now. Fans honestly wouldn't have it any other way. Storylines that diverge completely from their Sentai origins. So in Season 1, some episodes followed the basic idea of a Zyuranger episode, but many of them were rewritten to fit the high school life in Angel Grove, as well as public service announcements and lessons about things like honesty, teamwork, bullying, and responsibility. And then there's Rita Repulsa's ongoing schemes instead of Bandora's original motivations as shown in Zyuranger. The monster could have been the same, but why it appeared and what the episode was actually about were completely different. For example, MMPR turned the Pudgy Pig into a story about a food festival, while Zyuranger used the same monster in a completely different context. Even when MMPR reused monsters or action footage, character motivations and storylines were often rewritten to fit its own narrative. The number of things borrowed from Super Sentai varied from season to season, like Samurai, which was one of the most faithful adaptations in the franchise, but in Power Rangers RPM and Engine Sentai Go-Ongers, RPM represented the opposite, with still used Go-Onger's Ranger suits, Zords, and many monster costumes, almost everything else was reinvented. Like, Go-Onger was a comedic series with cartoonish villains, but RPM was set in a post-apocalyptic future where humanity had nearly been wiped out by the artificial intelligence Venjix. So there wasn't really any fixed adaptation style. Sometimes the Power Rangers closely followed Super Sentai, while other times it just borrowed costumes, Zords, and action footage and then worked on their own storyline. Cultural flavor: American teen comedy versus Japanese tokusatsu melodrama. One of the biggest differences between MMPR and Zyuranger wasn't the plot, it was the atmosphere that they created. MMPR revolved around Angel Grove High School, the youth center, sports competitions, and everyday teenage life in California. Characters like Bulk and Skull delivered comedy through pranks, slapstick, and failed attempts at recovering the Rangers' identities. Now, the Zyuranger's storylines were more rooted in Japanese tokusatsu tradition, mythology, and storytelling. The Rangers in Zyuranger were treated more like ancient guardians rather than just a bunch of kids. They focused more on magical creatures, ancient legends, family bonds, and emotional tragedy. MMPR generally balanced intense moments with humor and school life scenes, while Zyuranger often placed greater emphasis on themes like loss, destiny, and sacrifice. Also, Rita Repulsa was often portrayed as a comical figure who was frequently arguing with her minions, while Bandora was driven by deep grief and vengeance, although she did have her emotional moments as well. The adaptation didn't just translate the dialogue into English, it also gave the series a noticeably different emotional tone. Two separate legends, one Japanese franchise, one American icon. Although Mighty Morphin Power Rangers began as an adaptation, it eventually grew into something with its own identity and legacy. What started as a personal project eventually grew into something that millions recognized as its own thing. Super Sentai and Power Rangers served very different roles in their home base. In Japan, Super Sentai was part of a long-running tokusatsu tradition with other hero franchises such as Kamen Rider and Ultraman, and every year, they brought a completely new team, theme, cast, and mythology. In many international markets, Power Rangers became the more widely recognized brand, audiences becoming more familiar with names like those introduced in MMPR. At the same time, Power Rangers introduced many international fans to Super Sentai, helping create a global fan base that appreciates both franchises rather than seeing one as a replacement for the other. So yeah, at first, MMPR and Super Sentai can really seem like the same show with different languages, but if you look closely, it's very clear that they became two very different experiences. Now, we already talked about how MMPR was built using footage from 3 unrelated Super Sentai series rather than just one, so we're already familiar with that. All the characters, mythology, tone, music, and everything else was also reworked so that it could have its own originality. Super Sentai continued evolving as one of Japan's longest-running tokusatsu traditions. Power Rangers grew into a pop culture phenomenon with its own characters, history, and fan base. Neither franchise should be viewed as better or more authentic, as they both began with the same visual foundation, but ultimately became two distinct creative works with their own identities. So that's all we got for you this time. Thanks for watching. Stay safe out there. We'll see you in the next one.